So, without further ado, the webinar is called What Does Self-Care Look Like in 2019? So naturally, I Googled the future, and this is the image that popped up, and it made me laugh. So I just thought it might make all of you laugh. So let's get started. So really the point of this webinar, I hope, is that we're going to have some realistic conversations about what it really feels like to do anti-sexual violence work in 2018. I know the last few years have been hard and a struggle for a lot of people, but it feels like it's really all kind of come to a head in 2018, and so it felt like a good time for us to all sort of address how this last year has felt together and how we want to move forward. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about vicarious trauma, vicarious resilience, and really define what self-care is, and then take some time to outline what organizationally supported self-care looks like, and then also spend some time talking about individually supported self-care. And I really just want to encourage all of you to feel free to add to the discussion and the conversation as we move forward. I know that so many of you on the webinar today have been doing this work for a long time. So I want you to bring your wisdom to the webinar as we move forward. I want you to share what's been working for you, what forms of self-care you've been doing, and hopefully we'll get some really good conversation. Don't hesitate to write questions into the chat box as we go. I've already let Josie know that I'm happy to answer questions as we go, and then of course there'll be time at the end reserved for more questions. So I really hope that you'll be able to engage in the conversation over the next hour and a half, and it's not just me lecturing you, so feel free to join. So this is a pretty good visual representation of how I'm feeling in 2018. Emotionally for me, 2018 has felt fairly chaotic for me, and I think the peers that I have around me. There's just so much happening, it feels like, and so much that we're supposed to be paying attention to, both in our work and our personal lives all the time. Between Me Too and Time's Up and Harvey Weinstein and just what feels like an endless barrage of stories, it just feels like everyone around us is talking about sexual violence. And I know for me that's been true because I work in the anti-sexual violence field. But for the first time, it feels like there are, for folks of us that are in the movement, that also for the first time it's not just our colleagues and our coworkers that are talking about sexual violence, but it's also like our families and our friends and our larger communities that seem more open to talking about sexual violence than they ever have before. The upside is really, that of course our work is being seen as more necessary and legitimate than it has been in years. And, for a lot of the programs I've spoken to, they're forming community partnerships and having conversations with their community that a few years ago just really they couldn't even dream of having. So there really is an upside to this larger conversation that I think it seems as though our movement, we're all sort of benefiting from. But I think the one thing that we kind of struggled to address, or I think almost maybe been hesitant to talk about, is that the major downside is that our work is suddenly all around us at every moment like never before. People in line at the grocery store, people in my social media news feed, people next to me in line to get coffee or at the pharmacy are talking about the current news as it relates to sexual violence. And so it's really hard to know when to step away or even how to step away, especially for those of us that are living and working in rural communities. It feels like, how am I supposed to figure out when is the space that I disengage from my community and get to have an opportunity to not talk about and think about sexual violence. I always receive a lot of disclosures of sexual violence just because of the work that I do, as I am certain so many of you on the webinar do. Obviously, we're talking about disclosures during work hours, on the crisis line, for me when I'm in the office, just answering the phone in general. But I made my peace with getting a lot of disclosures a long time ago, but now the disclosures happen kind of wherever I am because of the nature of our jobs. When people find out what we do, I would say probably 2/3 of the Uber drivers that I've had in the last year have disclosed sexual violence to me at some point during our ride. It just feels like it is always around us. This year I've just received a record number of disclosures from strangers, from acquaintances, from friends and family, and I can't control when it happens. It just sort of bubbles up and I have to deal with it. And I don't work direct service anymore. I have the opportunity to work out of a coalition, to do this work on a national level as a TA provider, and the main function of my job is not to hear people disclose sexual violence, and I'm feeling overwhelmed. So I really can't imagine if I was doing direct service like I have been in the past, how this would feel. And so I'm really feeling very empathetic for all of you that have joined on the webinar today, because I know that if I'm overwhelmed, the rest of you absolutely have to feel that way. So some days it just really feels like, leaving your house is a minefield. And all I know is that if this is what 2018 feels like, how the heck are we supposed to navigate self-care as we prepare to step into 2019 in less than a month? So I know that how I'm feeling is exhausted and chaotic. So I'm just wondering if we can take a few minutes to check in with all of you on the webinar and just see, how has 2018 been feeling for you? So feel free to write into the chat box. You can write, I believe you can type your answer to everyone or to just me or Josie, and if you would like your comment to be anonymous, we can read that aloud. But I'd really like to just check in with all of you and see how 2018 has felt so far. Already we've got a great answer. Karen says frantic, and I definitely identify with that feeling. Hannah says a dumpster fire, which feels accurate. Definitely a roller coaster. Intense, overwhelming. Christine says humbling, which I really actually very much identify with. 2018 has been very rough, especially dealing with racism. Absolutely. It's just felt overwhelming. Catherine says, stressful with so many things to do and so little resources. Debbie says, I find that I can hear anything at work and on the crisis line, but I feel a different range of emotions when at a party or at a dinner. Oh, Debbie, I so relate to that. When you're in your workspace, your work brain, it feels capable sometimes, but when it's happening in our personal lives and times in which you're not anticipating it, it's just so much harder to deal with. Others said exhausted, stressful, chaos. Christine says rewarding to know we can make a difference, which, love that, Christine, thank you. Darlene says dizzying. Difficult to not think of my own experiences with assault when talking about someone else's, which I also really identify with. And I swear there's a slide towards the end of the webinar where we're going to talk a little bit about what it feels like doing this work with survivors as a survivor yourself. Cassandra says, not sure how to send to everyone, but I feel almost desensitized to sexual violence conversations, which I can definitely understand and relate to. Suzanne says useful, which I love. Tough due to intersectionalities that exist in the movement and wanting to make sure all are included. I'm glad you're here, though, and that you're trying. So it sounds as though, feel free to keep adding your comments to the conversation, but I'm seeing a picture emerge, which is that we're all feeling fairly similar to how I'm feeling, that maybe this picture here kind of does represent where we're all at. So, at least I'm glad to know that I'm not alone. The rest of you are not alone. We're kind of going through this difficulty together. So let's just figure out, where are we supposed to go? How are we supposed to move forward together? If this is how we're feeling right now, how do we move past this? How do we shore ourselves up to prepare for 2019? Because from what I'm gathering, it's not really going to change anytime soon. That movements like, #MeToo and Time's Up and all these conversations around sexual violence aren't really going anywhere. And in a lot of ways, that's good. Our work is more useful and more necessary than ever before. And we're reaching a lot of people that are kind of coming out of the woodwork that finally feel like maybe now is a safe time to disclose, to have conversations, to seek support, to find healing. And so in a way, we have to be grateful for what's happening right now. But we also, I think, have to be really realistic about how hard it is for ourselves and for the people around us, for our colleagues, and figure out a way through it. So let's just spend a little bit of time talking about vicarious trauma. I know that probably a lot of you on the webinar are veteran advocates. You've been here for a while. This really, already this buzzword means something to you. But I just want to take a time to make sure that sort of everyone on the webinar, we're all on the same page about sort of what we're going through and the words that we can apply to our experiences. And also I found that for myself, even though I've been in this movement for, 8 or 9 years now, that it's always been helpful for me to sort of reacquaint myself with some of these concepts. Because sometimes when I get a little too cocky, I get a little too comfortable, I kind of think maybe I know everything, that I slip back in my forms of self-care, and I think that I don't need to take care of myself because I've been doing this for so long and I know so much. And so whenever I have the opportunity really to do webinars like this or to provide technical assistance or write publications on some of these topics, I myself have to get reacquainted with these concepts and often learn things that I hadn't really thought about or reacquaint myself with concepts that I did know but hadn't thought about in a while and just sort of needed to be reintroduced to. And that's always been helpful for me, so I hope everyone on the webinar will find it helpful. So first, let's just focus a little bit on sort of why we need self-care in the first place, because I would say that self-care is a buzzword that our movement loves to throw around, and the larger society, I think, has caught on to this word and this phrase and this concept and sort of twists it to how they need, and I don't always know if we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about self-care. So let's just kind of focus on why we need self-care in the first place. Vicarious trauma is how our bodies and our minds and our spirits and our relationships react to and are impacted by the profound despair and pain that we witness every day when we are working with survivors. Vicarious trauma it's a process, it's cumulative. It's not something that can just happen after hearing one survivor story or spending 1 or 2 days on the job. Vicarious trauma is a process that it's cumulative and it's built up over time by the memories that are obtained when we listen to the traumatic experiences of survivors And, not just listen to, sometimes we're literally witness to the traumatic experiences that survivors are going through, or re-traumatizing of survivors. And it really affects our sense of safety, our trust in ourselves and in other people, in the institutions that are meant to support us as a community. And it affects our sense of self-esteem, and it affects our ability to connect with others, and really feel, I think, a sense of control over our lives. This work it's difficult. It's important, and it's fulfilling, and it's rewarding, and we're all here for a reason, which means that we care about this work, it means something to us, and we love doing it, but we can't deny the fact that it's difficult. It's really no coincidence that the manifestations of vicarious trauma look so much like individual responses to sexual violence. I mean, everything I just named is exactly how survivors are coping with and struggling with their trauma, right? It's affecting their sense of safety and their self-esteem and their ability to connect with other people and their trust in themselves, their institutions. So it makes a lot of sense that really what vicarious trauma looks like is the trauma that we are seeing in the survivors we work with also manifest in ourselves simply from hearing such an overwhelming amount of traumatic experiences every day as part of our job. And so when when so many of us are doing this work with survivors, as survivors, that really complicates how we experience and also navigate vicarious trauma. So I think, that just adds another layer. If you identify as a survivor and you're doing this work with survivors and you're experiencing vicarious trauma, that's just a lot of layers to cope with. And like I said, we're going to get into a little bit later more specifics about sort of if you identify as a survivor while you're doing this work. But I just kind of wanted to throw that out there. It's also, I think, important to say that it is natural to experience vicarious trauma, that when we look at any sort of helping profession, that a level of vicarious trauma exists within the work. And I think it's also important to mention that this is just especially true when we're providing services in rural communities. That is primarily where I have done the bulk of my advocacy work, is in rural communities. And, as rural advocates, we're on call for, really long stretches of time. So, you have that phone, whether it's ringing or not, at any moment in the day, no matter what you're doing, there's this nagging feeling in the back of your mind that someone could be trying to contact you, that you need to be talking to a survivor at any moment. And for me, I was sometimes on call for weeks at a time. And, I'm not saying that's healthy or that those organizations were really doing right by the workers that worked there, but it's a reality that exists when we, as rural advocates, have often so few employees on staff and such large, sort of vast service areas that we're covering, that realistically a lot of us are on call for a long time, that we have really heavy workloads, that we're working with a lot of people, we're juggling a lot of plates all of the time, that often we're really isolated from our coworkers. One of my favorite parts of my job is to have national trainings or in-person trainings where I get the opportunity to bring rural advocates together into a room with each other and talk with each other and share, because I found that so often in rural communities and rural programs, you guys don't even have much of an opportunity to talk with each other because of the amount of workload that you're doing, and that you are out in your communities doing the work, that you don't really have as much of an opportunity to have regular staff meetings, regular supervision, time, just downtime with your coworkers to talk about the work that you're doing, to share across counties the things you're accomplishing or the things you're navigating. And so if you rarely have an opportunity to talk with your coworkers, that means you kind of rarely have an opportunity to connect with other people, other neighboring programs, other people in your state, other people in the country. All of those things. So just the reality of being a rural advocate, I just think adds a lot to the vicarious trauma. And so I want to say that, however, just because it is common to experience vicarious trauma and that it is somewhat normal to experience vicarious trauma, that doesn't mean that we can't alleviate it, that we can't navigate it, and that we can't prepare for it. So here are just a few of the symptoms, the signs, the experiences of vicarious trauma. Some signs that you might be experiencing vicarious trauma include physical responses, like changes or disturbances in your appetite or your sleep patterns, or even chronic illness. I know that when I've worked at rural agencies, and honestly even here at the Coalition, we're often chronically ill. It seems like we're just taking turns with who is healthiest enough to come to work that day, that we're always passing illnesses between each other, that our immune systems clearly are struggling. And often that is, I think, in relation to the vicarious trauma that we're experiencing, and then also in relation to the changes in sleep and appetite and our just ability to care for our bodies can really lead to that chronic illness. Other symptoms that you might be experiencing vicarious trauma would be starting or resuming or increasing the use of caffeine or nicotine or alcohol or drugs as a means of coping with or numbing out from work. And I think that when I read that sentence, it sounds really extreme, that everyone when I talk about this is like, well, I don't do drugs, so we're fine. And that might be true. I hope that's true for all of you on the call today. But that when I worked at rural agencies and when I talk to rural agencies, it's really common joke of like, well, I'm going to go home and open that bottle of wine tonight. Or when I worked at rural agencies or when I visit them, there's often sort of a circle of chain smokers right outside the agency. That everywhere I've worked, people have really needed to utilize caffeine and nicotine and alcohol to really cope with their day. And I think we really normalize that for each other by making jokes about it, and by not really seeing it as what it is, which is a symptom of vicarious trauma, and as a way of not really taking care of our bodies. Other signs or experiences of vicarious trauma can include just feeling anxious or frustrated with clients and coworkers, feeling helpless or paralyzed, or just becoming very controlling and regimented. I know I've personally seen that at the agencies that I've worked for. Other signs can be having no reaction to stories that used to affect you or that friends and family find disturbing. I think for me, this is the one that's just sort of ever present, that when survivors tell me things, or when family and friends tell me things, or frankly just when I'm reading the news about tragedies that are happening around the country, things that are happening, I can really not tap into the empathy that I'm feeling. And I can really just dismiss those stories and kind of have no reaction and lose that empathy that I really started this work with, I think. Really, I see someone in the comments writing, yes, desensitized. That's exactly the word I'm struggling to find. Feeling desensitized to those stories that you used to find disturbing or that used to be hard when you first started this work, now just feel like, yeah, of course that happened. Somebody in the comments wrote numb, exactly what I'm talking about. I think another sort of version of that then would be laughing at humor that you once would have considered really offensive. So gallows humor. Once again, totally experienced this at every single agency I've worked for, that folks really had to, or really felt okay sort of joking with each other and finding humor in kind of disturbing things that I think when we first started the work wouldn't have been okay, or I would have been sort of shocked by, and now is just sort of like, yeah, that is kind of funny. And then I think the last one that I wanted to really mention was just feeling less available or empathetic to the problems or friends and family members. And I think on this list personally, for me, that is the one that I have felt the most strong, and the one that I feel the most disturbed by personally. Because at the end of the day, when I come home and my friends and my family and my partner are just annoying to me, are overwhelming to me, and I'm like, you people don't have real problems. Just leave me alone. I've listened to people have real struggles all day. I don't have time for your petty problems. That feels really gross. I don't like that, but that is genuinely a response that I've had. And I think that a lot of the people that I've worked with at rural agencies have also felt. Debbie wrote, nothing left for family. That is exactly how I feel. Debbie, you're really getting me today. Like, just that when you come home, you're like, my bucket is full. Don't you dare add one more drop to my bucket because I can't handle it. And that doesn't feel good. I want to feel there for my family and my friends and my partner. I want to be there for them. And so I think that really summarizes a lot of like why we need to navigate vicarious trauma, that it is natural and normal, that you are not crazy, that you are not weird, that you are not ready for this work just because you're experiencing some of the things on this slide. I think we have to know that it is natural that you might feel this way, but we can take steps to avoid this. We can take steps to alleviate this, and we can check in with ourselves when we see these symptoms present. I'm seeing other people write in the chat box. Danielle said, I've snapped at or been impatient with clients when I'm not doing good self-care, which I totally recognize as well. And then Cassandra wrote, my work gets the best version of me. Home life gets the less happy version of me. Oh my gosh, that's really resonating for me, Cassandra. So what I'm glad to hear is that we're all kind of on a similar page, and we're kind of experiencing these things and recognizing them in our lives, which I think really is frankly the most kind of big, important step we can take at the beginning, is just recognizing that we're experiencing some of this stuff and realizing we got to do something about it. So what are we going to do, you guys? Don't worry, I have some answers. So I don't know if very many of you on this webinar today have ever heard the term vicarious resilience. Feel free to chime in if you're like, oh yeah, old hat, I know all about that. But I personally had never heard of it when I was an advocate. It took coming to the coalition level and doing sort of national level technical assistance work with sexual assault programs to really have ever heard of or been introduced to the concept of vicarious resilience. And vicarious resilience is really just choosing to draw on the resilience and the healing that we witness, the strength that we witness from survivors every day, so that we can also feel that resilience reflected back in ourselves. Just like we mirror the symptoms of when we're experiencing vicarious trauma, we're really mirroring the symptoms of trauma that survivors are experiencing. We can also choose to mirror the strength and the empowerment and the healing and the resilience that survivors are experiencing every day also, and mirror those back in ourselves. In my experience, like I said, rural advocates really experience vicarious trauma at elevated rates. But rural advocates also, I think, are just in a unique position to experience vicarious resilience. We're able to see the strength and hope of sexual violence survivors every day. We get to witness our communities come together and do great things for survivors. We really get to take the resilience that we've learned from survivors and use it to manage the vicarious trauma that we experience. Vicarious resilience is a form of self-care, but it's also just sort of a way to view our work. It's a skill that, I'm not going to lie, it takes practice to learn to mirror vicarious resilience. But it can radically help vicarious trauma to choose to view our work through a different lens. And it really is choosing to view it that way. Choosing to view it that way every day and every moment and every week. You can practice this skill with your coworkers, mirroring for each other, reframing for each other, asking for help when you need it. When you are feeling like you're snapping at or being impatient with clients, you can go to your coworkers and you can say, look, I am struggling today. I am experiencing vicarious trauma real bad, and I need you to reframe this for me. Here's what's happening. Here's what the survivor did. Reframe this for me. And I've done that. I've repeatedly gone to my coworkers that I trust have the same philosophy and understanding of the work as I do, to help reframe the work for me, or the interaction that I just had. I know that when I was a housing and transitional housing advocate for a little bit of time here in Iowa, and that was the hardest the work ever got for me, was doing housing advocacy. It was seeing the hardest possible survivors to find resources for, and just it felt like banging your head against a wall every day. And so during that time, I really had to very regularly choose to go to my supervisor, choose to go to my coworkers and say, I am so frustrated with this person right now. I just need them to do X, Y, Z, and I just can't handle why they're not, but I don't want to feel this way. Please reframe this for me. And I would have someone that was not in that situation, someone that was not as experiencing as high of a level of vicarious trauma as me, be able to help me understand why the survivor was acting the way they were, why they couldn't take my choice, why they weren't making the decision that I wanted them to. I needed someone that I trusted to be able to draw that line for me, to be able to connect the negative interaction that I just had back to the trauma that person was experiencing. And and I think it works different for everyone, but for me, once I can connect back to the trauma, why that interaction went bad or why that person isn't doing what I need them to do or want them to do, then I suddenly can have so much more patience. Then I can greet them with love and strength and support, but I needed someone to be able to do that for me, and frankly, on a fairly regular basis. And so I think that that's really where we got to start. But once you practice with yourself and with your coworkers, I'm not going to say you're never going to need somebody to help reframe things for you. Of course you are. But the more you practice it, the better you get at it, and the better you're able to do it for yourself. To just be able to see the strength and the resilience even when the survivor or the community can't. So, like I said, vicarious resilience, it's a form of self-care, but it's just a way that we can view our work. It's a lens through which we can view our work. So if it's a form of self-care, what exactly is self-care? So self-care is really taking an action to care for your physical, your mental, or your spiritual health. Our strength as advocates really comes from being emotionally healthy and balanced. When we are healthy, we can bring our best selves to work every day and do the best work we possibly can for survivors. I think other folks have really kind of even referenced this so far in the chat box, really, that when we're doing good self-care, when we're taking care of ourselves, we bring our best selves to work and we can do the most for survivors. I think something that we often gloss over when we talk about self-care as a larger movement is that self-care isn't just an individual thing. It's not just something that you as a person are required to do. Self-care is both organizationally and individually supported. We spend, I think, a lot of time talking about the individual self-care. And I'm going to talk about the individual self-care on this webinar, don't get me wrong. But I think it's most important that we start by talking about the organizationally supported self-care, because I think we gloss over it so much. that I think it's really important that we start here and we have a really good understanding of what organizationally supported self-care really looks like. I get the most questions about organizationally supported self-care because I think so often self-care in our movement, but also in just sort of our larger culture, has been sold to us as bubble baths and glasses of wine. So really, then I think people are like, what the heck does organizationally supported self-care look like? Because let me tell you, it is not passing out wine at work. So as we really build and strengthen our sexual assault services, it's imperative, I think, that we have a plan that is both proactive and responsive to vicarious trauma experienced by staff and volunteers. Vicarious trauma simply is the result of the work that we do. So it is the organization's responsibility to work with advocates to address it and to lessen it. Organizations are responsible for creating policies and procedures and a working environment that is safe and healthy for all of the workers. As leadership, for leadership on the call, we can create a support system within our organizations that assist advocates with vicarious trauma that they're experiencing. And our organizational responses to vicarious trauma can really start from the beginning of employment. But it's never too late to start. So first, I think we have to start with the basics, with the foundation, which is that every staff member should be given a salary that supports a living wage. I've worked with a lot of advocates that have a side hustle, that have a second job, that have a second or a third job because they can't support themselves or their family on just the salary that they receive from their organizations. And I think we really have to start talking about this. In Iowa, we actually did something that I think I'm really proud of, which is that we took a salary of all the programs across the state and said, what are you paying your advocates? And our funding source, they're called CVAD, I'm sure they're called something different in your state, they set a recommendation, a strong recommendation, and said, this is the level that we think salary should be at, and we don't want to see any employee paid underneath that level. And that was a really big deal, having our funding source to be able to say, this is a requirement and you need to meet it. You cannot be paying people as little as some of these organizations are paying. Because if we have to have a second or a third job on top of this job, how are you ever going to be able to take care of yourself? I just don't think it's possible. I did it for years. I had 2 jobs. And when you also consider the amount of on-call work that you have to do in rural communities, really it feels like a third job. And I didn't have a family to support at the time, so I can only imagine how difficult this can be for advocates with more complicated financial situations than I had. So I think we really have to start with providing a salary that supports a living wage. We also have to provide adequate health insurance. Another thing that the state of Iowa did, our funding source here, said was that workplaces were required to pay, or honestly, I'm so sorry. I can't remember if they said required or it was just so heavily encouraged that everyone did it. The result was the same, but that the funding source said agencies need to pay 90% of the cost of health insurance, that no individual employee should be paying more than 10% of the cost of their own health insurance, because that's part of being paid a living wage, is that if you pay someone a living wage but then their health insurance costs them $500 a month, you're not really paying them a living wage anymore, because so much of their salary has to go to just basic health insurance. So starting with a living wage, adequate health insurance, and then providing people sick and vacation time, paid time off, is really important. And then what goes along with paid time off is clear and enforced protocols for how people use that time off. I've seen so many rural agencies that advocates get into like almost like contests, like, oh, you haven't taken a vacation in 6 months? I haven't taken a vacation in a year and a half. Oh, you haven't taken a vacation in a year and a half? Well, I haven't taken a vacation in 5 years. Or things like that, where it's almost like a badge of honor of how hard you work and how much you're putting into the agency. And I think we really have to stop that. We have to recognize that that's not a cool thing to do, that we have to take care of ourselves and we have to take care of each other. And that means enforcing people taking time off, staying home when they're really sick, taking vacation time when they need to take vacation time. There's a rural agency that I spoke with that does something I think really kind of radical and cool, where they schedule all of their on-call time alongside of their vacation time. So when they sit down that month or every other month to create the on-call schedule, they also have everyone sit down and plan out what vacation days are you going to take, what vacation is happening right now. And I think that that really encourages employees and coworkers to recognize how difficult and how traumatizing the amount of on-call work we have to do is, and encourages those employees to see how important vacation time is, and that it is a requirement to take it off, just like it is a requirement to fulfill your on-call hours. The next thing that I think really is sort of needs to be organizationally supported is access to training about sexual violence, and also access to training specifically about vicarious trauma, which I'm so glad you're all getting right now. So I think what's so important about access to training about sexual violence is that what I've found in working with rural agencies is that whenever we house domestic violence services and sexual violence services together, sexual violence services inevitably get put on the back burner. They're usually less funded. We have less staff members dedicated to it. But I think another reason why it really gets put on the back burner is, and maybe even one of the main reasons, is that people are nervous about it. A lot of the agencies that I work for, advocates felt very confident working with domestic violence survivors, but when a sexual assault survivor would call or a sexual assault survivor would come in, they weren't really sure what to do or how to help that person. And there's a lot of factors at play there, and frankly, this could be 4 more webinars about this particular topic, but one of the reasons is that we often don't get specialized training about sexual violence services, about how to support and empower and work with survivors of sexual violence. I know that that is how I felt when I was an advocate, that I got a little bit of training at the beginning, but then I started working at my agency, and we had 8 domestic violence advocates and 1 sexual assault advocate. And that really showed me as an agency where we put our priorities, where our skills were meant to be utilized and learned and spent. And when a sexual assault survivor would come in and that one advocate that was a sexual assault advocate didn't have the time or the capacity to work with, and the rest of us were supposedly trained to work with sexual assault survivors, I often panicked. I was confused. I struggled. I didn't really know what I was supposed to be doing with this person. And so I hear that constantly. I really see that replicated all over the country in agencies all the time, that rural advocates are confused and sexual assault work feels confusing and murky and uncertain. And when we feel uncertain about our work, that adds to our level of vicarious trauma. You know, all of us join this work because we wanted to help survivors. We were excited to help survivors. We wanted to help people. And so at the end of the day, we want to feel like we helped people. And when at the end of an interaction with a survivor, you're not really sure if you did what you're supposed to be doing or helped them how they wanted to be helped, it doesn't feel good. And when we don't feel good about our work, it's just hard to bring our best selves to work every day. So I think it's really important to get specific training about how to work with sexual violence survivors and specific training on vicarious trauma. I'm seeing a couple of comments about this, and what I can do is I can send I don't have a link for a specific online training course that is specific to, I can't give you like a 3-hour training of everything you need to know about sexual assault survivors. But what I can do is I can connect with Josie, and the two of us we can figure out what are some maybe New York specific training that are coming up, that exist, that are maybe recorded webinars. I can also put together a list of our previously recorded webinars, send publications, provide as much follow-up information for you guys on the call as humanly possible, okay? So we'll send all of those resources in an email. So once again, feel free to just keep writing into the chat box things you want. If there's like specific topics about sexual violence services you'd like to know more about, just feel free to put that in the chat box. We'll kind of gather all of that at the end and see what kind of resources we can get you. The other sort of organizationally supported things that we can do are really to mentor newer advocates as experienced advocates. That we can put measures and policies and procedures in place so that new advocates feel welcomed into the work and feel confident in how they do their work. I've worked with so many agencies that, and once again, this is really how I felt, but I've continued to see this happen across the country, is that when new advocates are hired, they're just sort of dumped into the work. Maybe they're given a couple hours of training, maybe they went through some sort of certification process if their state requires it, but then they're just sort of like released into the wild, like answer the phone, start helping people, good luck. And I think we could be doing a much better job of like creating an onboarding process to be able to help the new advocates figure out what is our philosophy, what is our approach to work, to mentor experienced advocates, to listen to other advocates answer the crisis line before we're required to answer the crisis line, to follow experienced advocates around the community and see how they talk to survivors, see how they connect to community members, to have regular supervision, not just as a new advocate, but continually. I never really had regular supervision when I was doing direct service, and now I have supervision every week, and I am so grateful for it. I am excited to have it. I used to think of supervision when I was an advocate as just the time in which I got in trouble. It was just like, oh, this is the time when my supervisor is going to tell me all the things I did wrong. And that's not what supervision feels like to me now. Now supervision is like once a week, an hour that I get to have my supervisor all to myself and ask all the questions I need to ask, for us to plan things together, for us to brainstorm together, for me to get to hear what's happening across the agency, to hear how other people are coping or the work that they're doing and how it factors into my work, to get specialized individual support for the work that I'm doing. And my job is cool as heck. I really love it. And I am like a much better person in this movement for having regular supervision. And honestly, like every week, I'm just like, I wish I'd had this as an advocate. I wish I'd had a space, a regularly scheduled space where I got to check in, ask all my questions, not feel silly, and just feel supported. I think we also need to help in our supervision connect advocates to that strength and that hope that exists in survivor stories, that supervision can be that space where you are able to connect to that vicarious resilience, to have a scheduled time where that happens, but then also that supervision is also, or that, supervisors are available for debriefing in the moment, that you don't have to wait until your weekly or biweekly or monthly check-in with your supervisor happens to talk about something that was really hard or seek support, but that also your supervisors that you know and that it's communicated clearly how to get in touch with your supervisors, what kinds of things you can go to your supervisors for, and how you can connect and get that support. And then lastly, as far as organizationally supported goes, I think that organizations need to provide access to self-care activities, that you are able to access these self-care activities together, that it's, once again, not just individual things that you're doing on your own, but that you're able to engage in these conversations and in these self-care things during work time and with the people that are also experiencing vicarious trauma around you, and that sort of signals to the agency that you as an organization support their self-care, that you support what they're going through, and that you're sort of modeling that it's necessary to do these things. And the last thing I'll just say on this slide, because there's just still so much I want to share with you guys, and we're running out of time here, is that if you have any more questions about this organizationally supported form of self-care and like how to create some of these policies or procedures or structures, please don't hesitate to contact me or contact NISCASA, because we can help you do these things, because I know sometimes it can feel, the amount of things that I just listed can feel really overwhelming. But just know that me and NISCASA, we're here for you to help you kind of create some of these structures. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, we can help a lot. So now that we spent, I think, a pretty good chunk of time about organizationally supported self-care, we are going to dive in a little bit to the individually supported form of self-care. So we're going to go through 4 topics. We're going to talk about taking care of our bodies. We're going to talk about how to seek support. We're going to talk about supporting your coworkers. And then we're going to talk about choosing our priorities, which I think is maybe the one I'm most excited to talk about. Okay. So self-care, taking care of your body. It's, once again, I think that's sort of this like foundational thing that we have to talk about before we move forward with some of these other things, is really just literally taking care of our bodies. That just like how vicarious trauma and trauma itself impacts these many different parts of your life. It impacts your heart and your mind. It impacts your relationships. It impacts your workplace and your professional life. It impacts your spiritual self. It also impacts and it really impacts your physical body. So when we know the areas of vicarious trauma and the ways that they impact our life, then we can take those and figure out what are specific forms of self-care that can address all these different areas of our life. So in addressing taking care of our body, we can eat well. We can literally nourish our bodies. We can eat fruits and vegetables. We can reduce the amount of sugar that we eat. We can reduce the amount of caffeine that we're having and stimulants, which then, of course, cause problems with sleeping. We can remember to eat, because honestly, I've worked with so many places where we are all just running around to and from places and maybe hastily shoving a scone in our mouth over a trash can at the courthouse between appointments, and that we're really kind of bad sometimes about literally just remembering to take care of our body, to nourish our body, to feed ourselves, that we need calories for our body to function best, and we need calories for our brain to function best. We can engage in exercise, whatever that looks like for you. I think that it's really important to say that self-care looks different for everybody. There isn't one way to do it. You have to figure out what is going to feel best for you. My boss always says that for her, going to a spa would just totally stress her out. But wrapping her body in a soft little blanket and watching 80s action movies is totally her self-care. That would not be my self-care. But that's what I mean by you have to kind of figure out what works for you. And for me, engaging in exercise has meant hiking, has meant spending time outdoors. Being on a treadmill or something just doesn't do it for me. I like to get endorphins. I like to move my body. I like to see the strength of my body, but I want to do it somewhere really gorgeous. I want to go outside and be in nature. And that really connects to, in a couple of bullet points down, seeking spiritual or religious support is taking care of your body too. So for some people, that's going to be meditation. For some people, that's going to be praying. For some people, that's connecting with your spiritual or your faith community, but for me, that's really engaging in the outdoors. It's making time to spend time outdoors and to be in nature and finding sort of what's meaningful to me and then placing it in my life. So hiking is really kind of the exercise that feels good to me and makes me feel happy. But for people, it can be yoga, it can be swimming laps, it can be taking a lot of us here at the Iowa CASA office will just take laps around the building. A lot of people set like a timer on their phone to go off like once an hour, and they'll just do a couple laps just to remember, I need to get up, I need to move my body and get my blood flowing again. So figure out kind of what's working for you. Try to sleep enough. I know it's hard with on-call hours. For myself, even though it's actually been years since I did on-call work, I still take the greatest joy in like turning my phone off at night when I go to bed. I put it on Do Not Disturb so that no texts, no phone calls, no notifications pop up and I get awoken, because after all the years of on-call work, I'm a light sleeper. I'm used to trying to like wake up at a moment's notice and start talking to someone, right? So I still really relish being able to put my phone on silent when I go to bed. And so if you all, I'm assuming, are still doing on-call hours, that the days that you are on call, the days that you are not on call, that you really take great joy and comfort and that you are able to turn that phone off, that you relish that experience, and that you let the people around you know, like, this is what I'm doing. I'm taking care of myself. I don't care if you need me. Tonight, I'm just going to sleep all the way through. I'm going to go to bed at a regular hour. I'm going to get on a good sleep cycle. I'm going to take melatonin. I'm going to do whatever it takes to try to engage in enough sleep, because not enough sleep really can ravage our body and just make us feel overall more exhausted. And when we're exhausted, it's harder to do all these other things that we can do to take care of our bodies. Lastly, just meditation and practicing mindfulness. We've actually seen on brain scans how your brain literally heals from trauma when we meditate and we practice mindfulness. So being able to incorporate that into your day, I think, is really important. For me, it's really hard because I am used to like listening to something, like watching TV, listening to a podcast, reading a news story, like just always my mind is engaged with something. And so for me, I try really hard to get to spend even just 10 minutes. I'm going to turn everything off. I'm just going to be alone with my thoughts. It's hard in 2018 in this world to do this the way our world is structured, but I think it's really important. Feel free, P.S., in the chat box to write your own suggestions for taking care of your body or what you're doing to take care of your body. If we're getting we've already gotten lots of great things. If we keep getting those, maybe we can summarize some of the comments, send them back out to you after the webinar today, if we get some good stuff. But feel free to be writing in the chat box the ways that you like to take care of your body or the way that you like to do self-care. So the next thing we're going to just talk about is about seeking support. So, oh my gosh, I'm already loving the chat box right now. Okay, seeking support. So it's really important, I think, when you're feeling stressed or overburdened that you do take the time to seek support, to speak with your supervisor or your coworkers or even a therapist. Honestly, it's always been encouraged, every agency I've worked for, that I have access to a therapist. That might not mean that I'm going every week or every other week, but that I have someone who understands my life, that I've gone to see a few times, that knows who I am, that when I am struggling or I really do need to check in with someone, that I don't have to go through the process of like figuring out a therapist, figuring out if they take my health insurance, like updating them about my life, figuring out who I am, but that just someone that I have all those things in place. And when I'm really struggling and I really need to check in with someone, I have a person that I can point to and say, like, okay, I can go to this person. I can go to this therapist. They already know me. They know my insurance. I can just go. But that you also are able to speak with your supervisors and your coworkers, and that you just have designated people in your life that you can seek support for. For everybody, it's going to be completely different. For me, my partner and my friends, my family don't always get my work, honestly. I don't know if any of you are sort of feeling that way on the call, but for me, my family doesn't really understand what my job is. They never really did, to be perfectly honest. So I know that when I want to seek support or I need to vent or I need to just talk about how I'm feeling or how I'm struggling, they're not always the best people to go to for me. So instead, I go to my coworkers usually, or I have people that I've pinpointed. Maybe for me, they're even people that aren't doing this work anymore, but that used to be my coworkers years ago. So they understand the work. They know what I'm going through, but they're not actively experiencing vicarious trauma anymore. They've left the field, they've gone on to other professions, but they've been trained as an advocate. They understand the work. So just figuring out who in your life is that person that you have to seek support with. And I also just want to throw out there that you're able to call the crisis line. I'm assuming everyone in this call does not want to call their own crisis line. I never did. I've never even wanted to call a crisis line in like a bordering community that has a program because that still felt too weird. But you can look up a national number or a support phone number for another agency across the country, in a whole other state, in a whole other community where you're like, no one's going to know who I am, and just talk to them about the struggles. I think that's really important too, that we know that this work is also for us, that you're able to contact places when you're struggling with vicarious trauma and you just need to talk with somebody that like gets the work. There you go. Cassandra says, our agency recommends using a fake name when calling a hotline for information if you feel uncomfortable. So true. Yes, that is what I usually do, especially because I do national work. I've spoken to a lot of agencies across the country, so if I call, I use a fake name. I might give them some context that I'm like in the work or I know some things, because for me that usually just works out to be more helpful, that they understand kind of a little bit about who I am, but I'm not like, hi, I work for the Resource Sharing Project. I just, I'm a little more anonymous than that. So utilizing your support system. The last thing I put there, and I'm seeing some questions about it, is an EAP. And an EAP is an employee assistance program. Not everyone has them, but a lot of agencies do. And I found that I have worked for sometimes months or years for an agency before I ever learned that they had an EAP for me to use. So an employee assistance program is, let's see here, what's the best way to describe it? If someone is really good at describing it, feel free to include it in the chat box. But it's usually like your agency has set up a relationship with an employee assistance program that provides a certain number of like free, usually like over the phone therapy or services for employees to take care of themselves. So it's hard to describe because I think everybody's EAP works a little bit different. But here at Iowa CASA, our EAP allows us, I think, something like five therapy visits a year for free. I think we have to do it over the phone and talk to someone. And then also a couple of other things are like discounted. So it's like if we want to go to the gym and like swim laps or something, we get a discounted rate through the gym here because we have a relationship with that EAP. So like I said, I'm sorry, it's hard to describe because everybody's is a little different. But if your agency has an EAP, use it. Find out if your agency has one. And if your agency doesn't, maybe consider doing it because I think it can be really helpful and create, once again, that sort of agency-supported, organizationally supported model that says, look, we value you, we value self-care, and we want you to have access to it. Maybe in the follow-up materials, I will find a better explanation of what an EAP is and like send you guys some resources or something. So self-care, supporting coworkers. I feel like people have already kind of said this a little bit, but I'm just so glad that we're echoing each other. Clearly we're all on the same page, which I'm loving. So first I just want to say that the best way when we're supporting our coworkers is just to assume best intentions. like I said, there have been times when I have been frustrated with survivors. I have been angry with survivors, and I've gone to my coworkers and I've said, look, this is how I'm feeling. This is how I'm feeling, and I don't want to feel this way anymore. Help me reframe that. And if I had gone to coworkers that maybe didn't trust me or weren't willing to assume my best intentions, they could have been really upset with me. I've said some victim-blaming things in the heat of the moment when I am feeling frustrated and really feeling a level of vicarious trauma and, frankly, a level of burnout that I'm really struggling with. They could have just chalked it up to, like, she's a bad advocate. I can't believe that she's on staff. Like, why is she even here? And not helped me. But I think it's important to assume best intentions of our coworkers. Even when they don't go to you specifically looking for support, but you just hear them saying negative things about survivors or about their work, I think it's just overall best for us to assume that they're struggling with a level of burnout and vicarious trauma that they need help with, whether they're realizing it enough to ask or not. And so I think the best thing that we can do is just sort of supportedly reframe, that we help them see the work differently, that when you hear one of your coworkers saying something that you don't agree with or that you don't think is very kind, that you check in with them. If they're in a large group, maybe that's not the best time. Depending on the situation, it might be good to disrupt the conversation that they're having, disrupt the chain of words that they are saying and end it. But it could also be helpful to just pull them aside at some point and say, like, hey, I heard you say these things, and, you know, these things aren't in line with the mission of our agency. They're not really in line with victim-centered services. So I just want to check in with you. Like, how are you feeling? Do you think you're struggling with some vicarious trauma? Would you like to have more conversations about this? Do you think maybe it would be a good idea to check in with your supervisor? But just trying to assume those best intentions and then trying to help your coworkers when you see it happening. When coworkers come to you asking for that supportive reframe, when they're asking for that help, I want you to know that it's okay to say no, that you are not at a point in your own vicarious trauma, in your own day, in whatever's going on in your life, that you aren't able to provide that support. I don't think it's ever okay to just say no and walk away. I want to make that very clear. If you're going to say no, if you're going to tell someone, I'm sorry, I can't help you with that right now, you need to provide another option for them. So say, no, I can't right now, but at 3 o'clock I have some time in my schedule. I will have eaten lunch, and I think I'm going to be in a better place by then. So do you think that we can check in at 3? Or say, I'm really sorry, I just can't right now, but Diana's available, and I know she helped me earlier today, and she seemed like she was in a really good place. I think you should check in with Diane. Or say, I think this is a good time for your supervisor. Or even saying, do you want to call a crisis line right now? Why don't we Google one together that's out of state or not in our community, and see if I can set you up on the phone. Those are all totally great ways to say no. But that you're allowed to say no and that you don't have the capacity to help one of your coworkers right now. I know that I've struggled to say no before, that we all, once again, join this work because we want to help each other. We want to help people. So it can feel really hard to do, but I think it's important to figure out when you need to say no. And then, of course, suggest another form of self-care. So help them figure out what would feel really good right now. Whether you've talked to them and engaged them in that support and now they're going to leave the conversation and you just check in and say, like, what are you going to do after? Where are you going to go from here? What else can help you? Or as an option when you say no. Okay. Next, I just want to talk about choosing your priorities. So I know, I've said it a couple of times now, but I know that you're all here because you care about survivors. And you care about survivors not just during business hours, right? We care about survivors 24 hours a day. We care about our whole community. We care about survivors that are experiencing homelessness because they identify as part of the queer community. We care about survivors that are enduring daily acts of racism. We care about survivors that are struggling with housing because of their immigration status. So, it can feel really enticing to keep our heads down and just tune everything out that doesn't feel like it is immediately in connection to sexual violence. It can feel really enticing to just turn off the news, never look at social media, not pay attention to what's going on in the world or our community, and just do our work and go home and forget about the rest of the world. That feels incredibly enticing to me most days. But if we want to remain committed to social justice, we can't tune it all out. If we want to remain committed to the other social justice movements that are inherently connected to ours, we just can't do that. In our daily work with survivors, we need to keep all these plates spinning. We need to not just pay attention to the sexual violence that's experienced by cis, straight, white, middle-aged women, but we need to be paying attention to all the other social justice movements that are also fighting for trans survivors and queer survivors and Black survivors and Indigenous survivurs and all the kinds of people that exist in our community and all of the people that are marginalized in our country. It's exhausting to think about, but it's just something we have to do. We aren't just advocates during our work hours, but we're citizens of our community that genuinely care about everyone in our community. So what does that mean for our time outside of work? I have a couple of suggestions. So this is just kind of what I've figured out for myself, and honestly, I would love if other people want to chime in the chat box and figure out what's working for you. But for me, this is what I figured out. Spend some time figuring out what is most important to you. What are your values, and where do you want to place your focus? And then take into consideration your capacity, because we don't all have the same capacity. I am someone that doesn't have children. I have someone that doesn't have a connection to my biological family, and so I don't have a lot of the sort of social requirements, or that sounds awful. You all love your families. The time to engage with your families that you need to have, I don't have a lot of those things, and so I have a lot of free time. So I have a greater capacity, frankly, and so I can take that into consideration. The rest of you might not have as much capacity, or your capacity just might look different than mine. So first you have to figure out what's really important to you and where you want to focus, and then figure out what your capacity is. So do you want to focus on engaging your family in a healthy dialogue to provide them with education? Is your priority and the place that you want to focus your direct immediate family because that's what would feel most helpful or impactful or frankly just the most exciting for you to do? Great. Do you feel like that feels exhausting and you'd rather focus on engaging your local community in activism? Great. Does that feel like I'm an introvert and engaging with my local community's activism sounds exhausting, and you'd rather want to focus on engaging social media and creating a space that feels safe for those that have been marginalized online? Cool. Like, those are all options. Like, you get a pick. You don't have to do all three. You don't have to do all of them, but you have to figure out sort of where you want to place your focus. You have to figure out where your passion is and then what you have the capacity to do. So the next step is, I think, you got to make a plan. So it can even be a pretty loose plan. That's okay. Do you want to, every other racist thing that your uncle says, you're going to try to engage him in a reflective and educational conversation? Are you going to, once a month, attend a local rally or protest or community gathering? Whatever that looks like, whatever that is, just pace yourself. Make the plan so that you don't burn out in February and just decide, I'm going to tune everything else out, the world is a trash fire, and I don't want to pay attention to anything, and I'm just going to hide in my bed. Because let me tell you, I think we've all gotten to that place at some point, and that's okay. But that's why you have your plan, so that you don't have to, every single rally or protest or thing you hear about, be like, oh crap, I got to engage with that. But you also don't want to engage with nothing. So just figure out what your capacity is and make a plan for yourself. And then practice radical compassion with yourself when the plan inevitably fails. It's going to fail just because this world is exhausting. And as advocates, we just care so much about so many things that we're gonna mess up the plan at some point, and we just got to forgive ourselves when it happens and try to get back on track so that we don't burn out in February or March and just give up. The last thing I want to talk about before we get into talking about advocates that are survivors is just navigating the world. So navigating the world just feels exhausting these days when everyone wants to talk about sexual violence with us. So you're allowed to put up barriers when you are at or approaching your limit. You can gently let your family and your friends and community know that now might not be the right time to talk about this stuff, but in the future, it might be. You can set a time and a day, including during your work hours, when you are ready, available, and prepared to discuss these topics. I often have a lot that I want to say to my partner or my family about a particular topic, but I really need to pick the moment when I feel like I have the capacity to do so. It's just not my job to be single-handedly educating my whole community because I will burn out. You can also curate your social media. That's been really helpful for me. Figure out what social media, if any, feels good right now and helpful. For me, right now, it's not Facebook, but I'm still on Instagram because that still feels good to me. So this doesn't mean you have to choose to look away from what's happening in the world. You can follow people who are positively contributing to the world right now. I personally, as an example, I like to follow this account on Instagram called Urban Dads. Their mission is to celebrate African American dads and reshape society's view of Black fatherhood. That's what the mission is written in their Instagram. So when I follow their Instagram, I get to see, first of all, sweet little giggling babies, which is amazing. And I also get to counterbalance a lot of the negative information that we are fed about the Black community in news and media. So I get to hear about a community I am not a part of straight from the members of that community, and that feels good, not draining. And it also makes me feel like I am still engaging with the world and not choosing to look away from all of the terrible things that are happening, all of the police shootings, and all of the things that are piling up in the news media right now. I'm not looking away from them, but I'm finding the ways that I can engage with that information in a way that doesn't feel draining to me. And there are so many Instagrams or Facebook or people that you can follow, Twitter accounts that you can follow that are going to feel good to you. That's just one example of one that feels really good for me. When you are out and about in your community, you have the right to say, I can't help you right now, but let me help you dial our helpline and introduce you to the advocate who's answering the phone right now. They can support you, provide you information, and help you with everything I would have helped you with. So lean on your helplines. When you have people scheduled to answer the helpline already and you're not that person, utilize that support. Lean on that crisis line. If people are coming up to you in the grocery store, if your family members, are engaging in some of these conversations about sexual violence or about some of these topics, and you just can't be the person that helps them with it right now, that is fine. Lean on your helplines. That is what they are there for. If you are, and then lastly, just consuming information about sexual violence on your work time. I just want to remind you that if you are reading about sexual violence and trauma like I often am, because I know that people are calling our lines, people are asking me questions about 50 Shades of Grey, about Harvey Weinstein, about so many things in the media as it relates to sexual violence. 13 Reasons Why, all of these things. I feel the pressure to know what they're talking about. So I feel like I have to watch these TV shows and read up about these movies and read all these news stories about what's going on. If you're reading about sexual violence and trauma, you can do that during work hours. If there is something happening in the news right now that impacts your work, you can save that for work time, and you can save that for staff meetings. You can engage in those conversations with your coworkers during work hours. Don't torture yourself by interacting with that information during time that you could be spent with your family or doing, honestly, self-care activities and things that fill up your bucket in good ways. Okay, I know we're getting close to the end, and I want you guys to have time for questions, so I'm going to try to go quick. But this is just the time, like I said, this whole topic right here, advocates who are also survivors, frankly, this could be, like I said, a whole webinar unto itself, but I just want to mention it. So this is, I just want to say that, start this by saying that survivors have always been doing this work. From the beginning of rape crisis centers to now and in the future, survivors have been and always will be doing this work. Professionalization of our work has really contributed to us forgetting that fact and thinking of it as a profession, which it is, but that it's also something that was started by volunteers, by people not paid to do this, by people that just wanted to help their community because these were traumas they'd experienced themselves. So I want to say that vicarious trauma is not necessarily harder or more extreme when you're a survivor. As survivors, we have often created coping techniques and forms of self-care long ago out of necessity, and we can tap into these same methods as we strive to prevent or alleviate vicarious trauma in our life currently. Often, advocates I speak with, including myself, have really worked for programs who give the impression that advocates who are survivors are more fragile and more susceptible to struggling with this work. And I have found the complete opposite to be true. Use your strengths. You know how strong you are, so you know how strong the survivors that you work with are. Finding that vicarious resilience within your work might just be easier for you to do because you are a survivor. I also think that it's really important that supervisors take the time to individually discuss each employee's relationship with the work. We don't need to know who is and who isn't a survivor when we make hiring decisions, but it can be helpful to discuss that during supervision. I'm not saying you all have to disclose your survivorship to your supervisors, but if supervisors engage in conversations with the people they're supervising about their relationship to the work, it can be really helpful to then create a plan in place to best support that advocate's unique relationship to advocacy and sexual violence. My supervisor knows a lot about my survivorship, and that makes our supervisor-supervisee relationship so much easier because I don't have to explain things all the time. I can just say, hey, here's what's going on for me today, and she totally understands it, and we can work together to figure out how to manage it. And I think that's really important. Okay, the last thing I want to say before we get to questions is just that you should evaluate this, that organizationally supported self-care doesn't just have to be something you try and hope is working. You can take internal culture surveys, you can talk to the employees, you can get feedback from employees, you can try to get some evaluative measures on how your organization is doing. And then I think it's just really important that as new employees come on staff, that we immerse them in that positive internal culture that we've created, because we don't want to backslide. So as new employees come to the organization, that we really baptize them back into this great, amazing, organizationally supported culture that we have created. Okay, Sorry I got real quick at the end there, but I just wanted to have an opportunity for questions. And I think, Josie, maybe some things have come through that I haven't been paying complete attention to. So do we have any questions to start us off with?
No, it seems to be a lot of comments more so, but
okay.
As I'm looking through.
Sure, yeah.
Cassandra actually said she personally struggles with talking about sexual violence and daily work with her partner, forgetting that it's hard for others to hear too. Although he is interested, how do I get this outlet I need without putting my partner through secondary trauma?
Yeah, I mean, that might just be something you have to put a barrier about. I hear that he's interested in the work. So if he's interested in the work, a possible solution would be to have him go through training and become a volunteer, so that he understands more about your work, understands more about what your daily life is like, whether he chooses to be a volunteer or not. I don't know, maybe even your organization has like a policy against that or something. I'm not sure. But I've had partners that go through sort of like we here in Iowa, the first level of training, we call it victim counselor training. So it's probably different absolutely everywhere. But here, I've had partners go through the victim counselor training, and then they understand a lot more about what my work is, what my work looks like, and sort of what my everyday looks like, so that it's easier for them to understand when I come home from work and I'm really exhausted, or when at 3 in the morning I have to leave to go on a hospital call. They kind of get where I'm going and what I'm doing, and I would say it's made more empathetic partners. They're more likely to, make breakfast for me when I come home from that 3 a.m. appointment, and and takes care of the part where your partner is interested, but maybe doesn't need to hear every sort of day-to-day thing that your work is bringing up for you, and instead you engage in those conversations with other people in your life. So figuring out if that's a coworker or another friend or a therapist instead of your partner, I think would be my suggestion to you, something that's helped for me. Someone else wrote that their partner helps with work events, so that helps them understand their work, but isn't necessarily interested in doing a volunteer training with them. So then someone else wrote, what do we do if some advocates disagree or are not so enthusiastic about approaches to self-care and are creating a negative work environment? I'm assuming what you mean by this is like collective self-care, like self-care activities you do as a staff, because I'd like to think if you're talking about personal care approaches to self-care, that your coworkers would support you doing whatever works for you. And, I think that one approach could be to really have a very specific conversation as a staff, sit down at a staff meeting and have a conversation about vicarious trauma and vicarious resilience and burnout, and talk about what some of these things look like so that everyone's on the same page. Because like I said, I've often found that agencies aren't. That some of the older advocates are sort of like, oh, that's old hat. I learned about that years ago. I'm fine. I don't need any help, because they've been in the work for so long. But some of the newer advocates are a little bit more like, yeah, I just went through training and I just learned about how good this is and I'm totally on board to do it. And so I think sometimes at our agencies we're sort of in different places with self-care. I think the other thing is that if someone is truly not willing to engage in a form of group self-care, check in with that person individually, like as a supervisor, with what is it about this form of self-care that's not working for you? Is it, that we're all going to go on a hot air balloon ride and you're afraid of heights? I don't know. Are we going to go bowling together and that's something you did a lot as a kid and you have sort of negative memories of it? Is it figure out what is it that isn't working for that person? And maybe that person just during that time when as a staff you practice self-care, they need to go do something completely else. Maybe they're really introverted and they're like, look, group self-care does not work for me. It feels exhausting instead of rejuvenating. I would rather just go in that room by myself and color a coloring book for an hour while you guys do this thing. I think that's totally fine. Agreed. I saw another comment. Someone said, I don't feel like not doing advocacy work outside of work is doing nothing. You've already dedicated your literal life's work to the cause. I agree with that. I just want to clarify that what I mean by not doing advocacy work outside of work is that I don't think we get a pass as sexual assault advocates from engaging with the racism and homophobia and transphobia and other forms of oppression that our country is currently struggling with right now. We don't get a pass from caring about those things or advocating for the dissolution of those things just because this is the work that we do. I think sometimes, frankly, when I have been the most burnt out, I use that as an excuse. And I come home from work and I'm like, look, I spent 40 hours this week doing anti-sexual violence work. I don't need to pay attention to any other social justice movement. I don't need to pay attention to anything else going on in my community because I am dedicating myself to this one thing. But I just don't think we get that pass, that there are so many forms of oppression and marginalization that people in our communities and in our country are struggling with that we have to pay attention to. I think you can limit what those things are. I'm not saying you have to care about absolutely everything, but maybe you need to figure out one or two other things in addition to anti-sexual violence work that you really care about and want to fight against or fight for, whatever that looks like. And then I will also say that the activism that I've done in my life that is not related to sexual violence honestly sometimes feels like self-care because all I do and think about is sexual violence. I mean, I work in the sexual violence movement. My roommate and all of my friends are in the anti-sexual violence movement. When I go on vacation, I often visit people in other parts of the country that are a part of the anti-sexual violence movement, right? So I could say I've done enough with my life. I've dedicated enough of my life to this. It's all I talk about and think about. But I feel more tapped into my community, to my country, and I feel more rejuvenated when I also can tap into other social justice movements and fight for other causes that maybe I don't feel so closely aligned with. I hope that makes sense.
Yep.
Any other questions that we missed? Last call for questions right now, and I'll just say thank you to OVW for sponsoring our project that made it so that I was able to join you today. I honestly just love talking to you guys. You guys said so many interesting things. It was really good. And then here's my contact information. So like I said, my name is Leah Green. I'm the Rural Technical Assistance Specialist at the Resource Sharing Project, and I included my email address there and my phone number. Feel free to call me or email me if you want to talk about any of these things one-on-one, or you have other questions related to creating sexual assault services in rural communities. That's really the overarching umbrella concept of our project. So that means we have resources about creating support groups and reaching marginalized communities and doing outreach in rural communities and creating volunteer programs and pretty much any topic related to creating strong sexual violence services in rural communities. I probably can hook you up with some information or publication or something. Or we can just have a one-on-one conversation. So please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And then, of course, reach out to your coalition because NISCAS is doing really amazing work, and I'm so glad that they brought me today. And like I said, we'll collaborate. NISCAS and I will collaborate on some resources to send you guys after the webinar.
Any last questions? Okay. Well, you do have our emails and phone numbers. If you think of anything later on, feel free to reach out. Leah, thank you so much. That was a great webinar. Thank you for all the information. We will be sending out some other resources to fill in any gaps there. Thank you again, Leah. Have a great day. Everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye now.